Should you reload your rifle or transition to your handgun? The long and the short of it is, this isn't a complete question. There are so many different variables that I've ignored it for perhaps the last 20 years because I didn't think the question was asked well. It sounded something akin to, should I change my college major? I need more information. Change to what? What are the options on the table? Starting your own business? Joining the circus? I need to know more. And what's your personal situation? So it just never struck me as an authentic question. So I've, again, by and large, just ignored this. And if you press me, well, I want to know the bottom line. What does he think? Should I reload my rifle or should I transition to my handgun? If you're going to press me, the answer is reload your rifle and don't even bother with a handgun. Okay? But that's me and my personal situation, which I'll explain when we come right back. I'm Dr. Christopher Larsen, a veteran of the U.S. Army Infantry, founder of One Shepherd Leadership Institute, and author of Small Unit Tactical Doctrine. A couple weeks ago, I watched a YouTube video titled Reload or Transition, What You Should Do When Your Rifle Goes Dry or Malfunctions. And this was put out by the Tactical Hy-Vee YouTube video. And for the first time in a long time, I think this video, his name is Miles there, I think he was actually bringing up some valid points. And so I was pondering that, which led me to look up, just for, in preparation to this video, I really started looking up how many videos are in YouTube alone that deal with transitioning from either a rifle or a shotgun to a handgun. And I stopped counting at 40, not including the two that I'm going to discuss with you, so 42, and they dated back 10 years ago. So, you do simple math there, and it's saying that somewhere in the neighborhood of once every 3 months, yet another video pops up on rifle reload and transition to handgun, and this is just one more of those videos, frankly. Let's not pretend that it's the end-all, be-all. It isn't. But that said, there's just so much information out there, and again, it seems to be put out mostly by very credible training companies. I have no problem with what they're saying. They're saying, look at our technique and we can help you get this faster and faster and faster, this drill, and I see merit to that. But they never really answered the question, should you transition? Or why should you transition? Or what are the decision metrics of a transition? Or should you even carry a handgun? They didn't really address those. And I think, on Tactical Hy-Vee YouTube channel, Miles really starts to do this. His main point was this. Choose one default option, meaning either really hone in your rifle magazine change or really hone in a transition to a handgun. Now, he does offer, without much data or anything else, he just simply insists that the transition is faster. That's interesting, and I think I kind of knew that. I think we all intuitively knew that, but it is situationally dependent. The other thing that he points out is, if you're going to carry a long gun with a holstered sidearm, then you should go ahead and get used to that transition because you're taking advantage of that speed. And he doesn't explore that much farther. He says if you are not carrying a handgun, then by all means perfect your rifle magazine reload or fix your malfunction. And so I think that was pretty credible, and I started pondering this. And again, this video came out just a couple of weeks ago. And as I was pondering whether or not I was going to finally take up this question, Paul Harrell released a video about a week ago, and his video, if you want to watch it, and I will put these links down below for all the references I discussed today. His video, Personal Protection, Reload Your Rifle or Transition to Your Handgun, ? That was just a week ago, and he started to address this question, right? And when Harold picked it up, I will admit that I am something of a fan, so right away I thought, well, there's not going to be much more to say here, and he offers several different things in that short video. And the first thing that I appreciate about his video is that Harold covers a historical perspective. That is, he's looking at muzzle loaders, he looks at cowboy guns, and kind of the modernization, kind of a short trek up to modern firearms that we have today. And so he tries to answer it from those perspectives, which won't surprise anybody that he comes to, very, very different answers depending on, the technology of the day. So that's worth just watching the video for that alone. Then Harold moves into some hunting perspectives. And he concludes that the transition is often faster, but may not be practical. I have some friends who carry holstered handguns while they are hunting. And frankly, knowing the type of hunting that they're doing and where they're doing the hunting, that made a lot of sense to me. Though personally, I have never carried a handgun while hunting with a long gun. Right? I just haven't done it. Doesn't mean I don't see the merit in it, but I've never hunted bear, and I've never hunted boar. And so even with a long gun, I think when the game you're hunting is so incredibly dangerous, having a backup is probably a very, very good idea. And not just when the game is dangerous. If you are hunting rabbit in boar country, if you are hunting elk in bear country, this still makes good sense to carry a holstered sidearm. The handgun can allow you to maneuver through dense vegetation quicker, and if you are field dressing an animal, you can set down your long gun and work while still having a handgun strapped to you. And so I do take note that the colleagues that I know that do this as a matter of practice tend to carry 10 millimeter handguns, 45 ACP, or at the very minimum a 357 Magnum. So they come, loaded for bear, right? And that makes sense because again, if the game is charging you, then a transition, makes a lot of sense. So there's that. Harold then covers some self-defense perspectives and concludes, rather matter-of-factly, yes, the transition is faster in almost all cases. There's always going to be that odd one out. Now, here's where I said, okay, hold on. Because I am a fan of Paul Harrell's, I think he's, first off, I recognize him as a scholar. He has applied research right there in the field. He uses very simplistic statistics, but very, very effective. And so I appreciate that. And I also like his demeanor, frankly. I think from what he has said on YouTube that he and I come from a very similar backgrounds, at least in as much as our military service was about the same time, and I think both of us were infantry and, had a combat tour or two. He went on into law enforcement and competition shooting, but I think we both went into training, and I continued to train militaries around the world as well as other government agencies. And so I think we have a lot of similar background, and so it's not going to be a big surprise that I say more times than not I am in agreement with Paul Harrell, and where I disagree, it's nuanced. And so in this one, he says, self-defense is in fact faster to transition. No argument. But I would say, as someone who carries concealed for self-defense, I can't imagine a case. I'm really straining here to imagine a case whereby I have a long gun, shotgun, rifle, carbine, and I've also holstered a handgun in self-defense. This is beginning to sound like a John Wick movie. And back in the day, I did a little bit of IDPA shooting. Very much enjoyed it. I'm not here to bash it at all. If you've done it, and if you haven't, give it a try. It's a lot of fun. One thing that struck me, though, was that IDPA shooting was supposed to be practical, right? Practical, as in self-defense. And in the very limited exposure I've had to it, I never once saw anything that was practical. It was all very, very much aggressive, assertive. I was on the offense against, nefarious, people holding my family hostage or, robbing a bank or whatever it was. And thank goodness in IDPA, I had plenty of guns all around me to wage war. I found none of that practical because I don't, as a matter of habit, carry a carbine or a shotgun when I'm carrying in self-defense, and I imagine that if I'm at a a convenience store, or God forbid, I'm in a parking garage of downtown and something happens, I'm not going to have the option to transition. And so I think it's rather unrealistic, and not that Paul Harrell was going this direction, but I also think that if you really are in that situation, you're going to have a lot of explaining in court to do about why you came, looking like John Wick. Now, that said, go to 3 gun competitions, get out there and do your best, and you're going to transition and have a grand old time, right? This is a great sport, and I've got nothing against this. I've got everything for this. I just don't think there's a practical element to it. So live out your John Wick fantasies on the 3 gun firing competitions, and more power to you for doing it too. Now, then Harrell went into security services, and here I think we'll take a more serious note, because he does conclude that it is faster, and here I think it has incredible practicality, as much or more so than hunting in bear country. The reality is that a patrol officer, and I don't care what kind of security officer, if you use deadly force and you have a long gun, and it either malfunctions or shoots to empty, then the data suggests that transition is marginally faster than reload, at least in the vast majority of cases. Now, I say marginally, but hold on, that small significance can have an incredible practical significance in a life or death situation. And so here I'm very much wholeheartedly in agreement with people saying, well, hold on, transition to a handgun, to a sidearm from a long gun truly does matter for law enforcement officers and those professionals in the security forces. And I have to agree. I really don't have much to argue there. Finally, Harrell jumps into the military services, and he gives his kit that he wore in the infantry. I wore a very similar kit. And he concludes, yeah, it's faster, but it tends to be inaccurate, and he then goes in to say, look, there's all these other variables. How far away is the threat? What is the threat? There's just a myriad of variables, and he starts to explore a few of those. But then he does his Harrell type of analysis where he does applied research and statistics. And once again, I'm a big fan. So he does this. He fired at both 10 and 50 meters, if I recall. And he both retains his magazine, so he changes magazine and then continues to shoot. And then he just sets the weapon down and transitions to handgun. And once again, you can see that the handgun is faster. And he demonstrates both at 10 and 50 meters that the handgun is less accurate. Now, here's the nuanced difference. Where Harrell explains, okay, in a counterinsurgency environment, retention of the magazine is important, and I will absolutely agree with that. I'll agree that the retention of the magazine in almost every situation is important for, combat soldiers and Marines and warriors. That said, my habit when the enemy gets that close in, that a transition is practical, is that I am not retaining my magazine. Not at all. I don't even probably touch it. I simply drop it out of the drop it or drop and flip right out of the magazine well, and I've already got another one in. And so from that point, and given the battle rig and the tendency to carry flaps over a sidearm for retention, otherwise it just winds up falling out on patrol or in your crawl through the mud. We tend to protect it, and so now I'm going to suggest that if we redid that, and no, I'm not going to. But if we redid that and you drop the magazine and reloaded, this would beat the time of setting down the weapon, opening a flap, pulling the sidearm, and then engaging the enemy. And so I wonder about that. I'm like, okay, let's do that a little more, what I would say, stylistic, or I don't want to say realistic, because his habit, and that he's trained in, is to retain the magazine. In most cases, mine is not. I come back and get the magazine upon reconsolidation and reorganization. That's been my default. And I'm not saying one way is right and the other way is wrong. I'm just saying interesting choices there. But nonetheless, I appreciate the data. I think it was pretty reliable, and it was reliable and it was repeatable, right? So to me, that's very important. The next point on this is, let's take a moment and recognize how many, let's stick with infantry in this case, simply because it's what I know, right? It's what I can speak to. And I'm sure there are other military organizations and units that may carry more handguns than the infantry, but when you come to an infantry rifle company, you have approximately 130 assigned soldiers and attached soldiers. That they can be your fist forward observers for artillery, your 13 series, your medics, and you can even be intel or civil affairs. They can be attached to you. You tend to have about 124, somewhere in there, about 124 grunts, and about a half a dozen or more, other soldiers attached to a rifle company. Who carries a pistol? Well, here's who's allocated to carry pistols. Officers, so your commanders, and there are 5 per rifle company, coming right in at 4% of the soldiers. Your radio operators are authorized in many units to carry a handgun, and there are 5 per rifle company, coming right in at 4% of the rifle company. Your medics are authorized to carry a handgun. There are about 4 per company, and they come in at 3% of the rifle company. Your mortar chief, not the entire mortar crew, you usually have 2 chiefs because you have 2 mortar tubes up with the headquarters section, and they're authorized to carry a handgun. That's 1.5% of your rifle company. And then finally, your machine gunners, your medium machine gunners, you tend to have 6 per rifle company, and that's 4.5%. You add all of those together, all of them, and you're right at about 17% of your infantry rifle company carry a handgun. Actually, let me stand corrected. They are authorized to carry a handgun. 17%, not even 1 in 5. How many actually carry? Well, frankly, commanders, I've never seen a commander to my recall. I've never seen any of my commanders, platoon commanders, company commanders, carrying a sidearm. They all carried a rifle or carbine. None of our radio operators carried a sidearm. I'd say more of our medics do. Our mortar chiefs definitely did, and our machine gunners did, for what it's worth. Nonetheless, the real number that I commonly saw and experienced was about 9%, or 1 in 10 of our soldiers carried a sidearm. Now, I mention that. Why am I mentioning that? Well, the option to transition to a sidearm only rings true for roughly 10% of infantry soldiers. That's just all there is to it. So the other 90% don't even have the option of transitioning. Well, my goodness. Well, what do they transition to? Well, I'm glad you asked. We tend to transition to fragmentation grenades. I mean, come on. If the enemy's that close, fragmentation grenades. We tend to transition to bayonet or fighting knife. You bet. We still do that. We may carry a claymore, we may carry a rocket launcher. Some of us are grenadiers and will default to our 40 millimeter. So we can transition to many different weapon systems. But I think the other thing that you have to remember is that unless I'm fighting at 1 to 2 meters, and I'm not being hyperbolic here, unless I am fighting at 1 to 2 meters in somebody's kitchen, in a trench, in a jungle, dense jungle vegetation, if I'm fighting there, I certainly could, if I had a handgun, transition to it, but my fighting knife or bayonet is every bit at 1 to 2 meters practical and effective. Okay, so we're all carrying that. All of us. Even as a machine gunner, I had a fighting knife. I'd say we transition to that. But the other thing you have to remember, that if it's not there, if it's not in a 1 to 2 meter range, the intimate range of death and killing, then I'm probably at 10 meters, or 30 meters, or 60 meters from the enemy, and it just so happens that I brought 30 of my very bestest friends with rifles and carbines and machine gunners and grenade launchers and and hand grenades and claymores and everything you can imagine. So when my weapon system malfunctions or I simply run out of ammo, I have time to fix it. I have the time and space to change magazines. I simply communicate with the other warriors in my fire team, squad, and platoon, and I fix the problem and I get back into the fight. Worst case scenario, I don't fix the problem. Maybe it's a catastrophic failure, or maybe I've just gone black on ammo. Well, I simply call out enemy targets to the machine gunner right beside me. I call out enemy running through the defilade to the grenadier right beside me. I can help the medic take care of wounded. I can help the RTO, call in for fire or report casualties. There's so many things to do in the fight that here I am. I can help. I can contribute significantly even if I can no longer pull the trigger. And so, from my experience as an infantryman, transitioning just didn't make a lot of sense. I have a final thought on this, and yes, I've been giving this a great deal of thought. If I'm going to weigh in, I'm going to weigh all the way in. The last note is that we have to take that point into consideration. What are battlefield casualties and broken down into distance, right? I think this is a good area to study. And I think it's a good area to study because there is the psychological effect of using any weapon and certainly transitioning to a handgun. We have to consider these metrics as well. And so the historic wisdom through people's personal experiences and anecdotes, and no, a bunch of anecdotes do not add up to data. Let's be clear about that. They add up to a qualitative description, but certainly not a quantitative, metric, because again, it's not necessarily reliable, nor is it repeatable. Anecdote evidence is great for a qualitative understanding, but not necessarily quantitative. That being said, the historic wisdom is that 70% of casualties of direct fire systems, and I mentioned all of them, grenade launchers, machine guns, pistols, of direct fire systems, 70% of them are taken or inflicted at 100 meters and less. 20% are somewhere between the 100 and 500 meter mark, often called the quarter mile, although 500 is a little farther than a quarter mile. And then 10% of casualties by direct fire weapon systems are inflicted somewhere between the 500 meters, 500 yards, to 1,000 meters, 1,000 yards. Yes, there's a difference between a meter and yard, but for practical application, not so much. And I would say that this is true generally of modern weapon systems. What's modern? Let's say it's a repeating rifle, and let's make sure that it's rifled and fires a cartridge. So the end of the American Civil War. And I think that this starts coming true. And we see this come true in World War I, World War II, all the way up to our current wars today. Now, I say we see it comes true. I'm saying it holds to the wisdom. That's interesting. So I started looking. Surely there's a study out there that can, validate this or invalidate this. So sure enough, I found a study by John Salt, Small Arms, Small Data, Small Arms Shooting Accuracy and the Small Data Problem, 2016. He's from the UK, and this study was done for Cranfield Defence and Security. Now, the first thing Salt begins with is to recognize, and I'm going to read a little here. He says, data on small arms hitting rates is sparse. Paper analysis included 19 sources of data, giving 81 data points. Combat data is augmented with data from police shootings, range trials, or models and qualification scores. Now, here's my note on that, full stop. My note is that when I'm looking at his data, I noticed right away 67% of hits. Admittedly, this is a very, very tiny data set. It's not enough that we can really make a predictive analysis, but it does give us some quantitative data that can say, hey, are we looking at the right place in our qualitative data? And sure enough, Salt's study and his, his compiled research showed that 67% of hits were achieved at 100 meters or less. And he's looking at handguns, submachine guns, rifles, and machine guns. Oh, even Panzerfaust, okay? So he's looking at rocket launchers. And sure enough, 67%. Well, the wisdom said 70%, 67%. I'd say that's within a standard deviation. 12% of casualties were achieved between 500 meters and 100 meters. So we were saying 10%, that's the standard wisdom, and sure enough, 67 to 70, 12 to 10, leaving nominally 20 some odd, and we were guessing it'd be 20% between the 100 and 500 meter ranges. And so I thought that's what caught my eye right away was, Salt's study seems to more or less validate the old wisdom. Now, again, take that with a grain of salt, no pun intended, we need more research, and John Salt certainly would agree with that. Now, he goes on, quote, "The most obvious conclusion from the data gathered is to reinforce David Rawling's finding in Rawling 2006 study that shooting in combat is much, much worse than it is on the range. Operational research should, therefore, be highly skeptical of any research based on range firing that purport to reflect the realities of combat," end quote. Absolutely agreed. He goes on Salt goes on in his study to define the size of targets, and he did that for a very specific reason. He said the shooter often can only see a small part of it. And when you look at our qualification ranges, whether that's military qualification or police qualification or even CCW qualifications, you see about 2/3 of the human body. And his data said, no, you see about half that, maybe a little less. You could say, in effect, his data said people were shooting at much smaller portions of the human body than what we shoot at qualification. And so right away we say, wow, is qualification even valid? Now, so there's some good questions raised here. However, full stop, look, we need a standard of metric, a standard metric of measurement, and that doesn't need to be realistic. It doesn't need to perfectly represent realism. Instead, it needs to be reliable and repeatable. So just like ballistic gel is often criticized as saying, well, human bodies aren't ballistic gel. I agreed. We aren't. We're not made up of ballistic gel, and we include harder substance such as bone, which is why Harold often shoots meat, bone, and oranges. I don't know what he has against oranges. I like them. And timed performance is another situation that, believe it or not, everybody assumes timed performance is realistic. No, actually, it's not. But it is repeatable and measurable. And that's very important. And so our standard metric of measurement doesn't have to be realistic. It just needs to be measurable and repeatable. And that gives us enough validity, right? All right. I'm going to go on because I think there's some more interesting findings from Salt's study. Quote, "It seems clear from the data available that one reason or another, the accuracy of small arms fire decreases with the proximity to the target, so that the hitting rate does not increase as much as would otherwise be expected at closer ranges." Specifically, this study, I should have probably said, the study was trying to answer the question, why does it seem that accuracy decreases at very close, intimate distances of killing? And this is what he's trying to establish here. At those real close in, he was finding that, in fact, once again, the wisdom pans out. And the wisdom is that, yeah, people start missing really badly at 10 meters and in as the enemy approaches. Quote, "Even from the small amount of data collected, it's striking that the decrease in aiming accuracy with proximity is observable in data from all kinds of sources, strongly so for combat and police shootings. It may be possible to account for much of the effect of the shooter's uncertainty as to the precise precision of the target in dense vegetation. However, the persistence of that effect when jungle cases are removed from the data, and the strong proximity effect seen in police shootings where the effect of vegetation can be discounted, strongly suggests that positional uncertainty does not completely explain the effect. My own belief is that the psychological effect of enemy proximity must play a larger part, but it is not clear how much of this effect is due to enemy fire and how much is due to his mere presence." End quote. That's John Salt. I think that that's a fascinating study, and it does have implications, though exactly what implications I'm uncertain yet. It's hard for me to, put that to rest without more information. But one of the things is you have to ask yourself, okay, wait. If transitioning, if in fact I am correct, and simply dropping your mag and not going for a flapped, holstered handgun, if it is in fact quicker to change magazines to your rifle, then one might assume that a firearm rifle that requires 4 points of contact to effectively use, therefore being more accurate, might produce better results than a firearm that requires only 1 point of contact, handgun. And since accuracy diminishes at 10 meters in, well, that requires its own study, doesn't it? There's a PhD for someone who wants to go out and do a dissertation in it, and I think someone should. I pondered this, and I started thinking about the grass fire of 1983 out in the battlefield of Little Bighorn. Now, that grass fire exposed the battlefield, and for the first time, archaeologists could come in and do forensic studies of the battlefield, literally looking at which casings came from which firearm. They couldn't tell what soldier fired it, which cavalry soldier fired it, but they could trace his rifle or handgun literally across the battlefield as they retreated and fell into their final lines of defense before they were overwhelmed and the 210 cavalry soldiers lost their lives with Custer at Little Bighorn. Now, to determine the location of the most intense fighting, the researchers looked at bone fragments and wound marks on those bones, bullets and arrowhead strikes, literally where did they impact in the earth and things like this, broken and dropped field gear, shell casings, as I previously mentioned, doing police-type forensics on it. And they could tell when people were transitioning from rifle to pistols because of the evidence of pistol cartridges, fired and unfired. Some really cool findings have come out of the multiple studies. Many universities have since jumped into the forensic research of Little Bighorn, and you can find that on YouTube, history channels and whatnot. Researchers noted that at the location of the most intense fighting, U.S. cavalry soldiers dropped unfired live rounds as they attempted to reload. The interpretation of this repeated phenomenon and the presence of pistol cartridges led the researchers to speculate the fighting was in very close proximity and that psychomotor dexterity had greatly diminished. Soldiers had problem reloading, and we can say that if the more mundane task of reloading a rifle or handgun had become very difficult due to dexterity and psychomotor capability, then it's not difficult to imagine that accuracy was also suffering. Cavalry soldiers carried handguns as well as a rifle at that time. That was still very, very common practice. And in close battles, these soldiers were trained to transition to that handgun. But unless they were mounted and could make a quick getaway as soon as they emptied their revolvers, it's fair to ask what impact does the revolver actually have in battle? And clearly at the Battle of Little Bighorn, it did not go in their favor. So that transition to a handgun may have bought them a few more seconds of life, but ultimately ended in their demise. And so at that point in history, as we move on, repeating rifles, that is modern weaponry, machine guns, they soon relegate the horse charge to the history books. Yes, we see them as late as World War I, and yes, even recently in Afghanistan, there was horse-mounted special forces and infantry. And so I don't want to discount that contribution, but the exception to the rule proves the rule. And those were anomalies. The fact of the matter is that today the handgun in battle is essentially a paperweight. And as an infantryman, I would tell you, I was a machine gunner on 2 different machine guns for a year each, and I would tell you that the handgun was not useful. It wasn't. Well, I would advise any combat soldier that, any is a big word, but I would, as a general default, my answer is this. Look, you have weight. Pounds cost lives. If you're going to carry a handgun and several magazines of ammo, I would argue you could carry for that same weight easily 3, 4, or 5 more fully loaded magazines of rifle and carbine ammo. Carry that. And if you have to worry about a transition to a fragmentation grenade or a bayonet. This is why I conclude that the discussion of should I transition from my rifle or carbine or even a shotgun to a handgun, the answer is no. You shouldn't even be carrying a handgun. That said, there clearly are situations where this question has great merit. As we said, hunting in dangerous areas. That has to be considered. And again, it seems to be faster to transition to the handgun. So if you're under threat by a large animal, I'd say transition makes sense. If you are a security officer in tight quarters, CQB, CQM sort of situations, and you go have a weapon malfunction or go empty, then transition to a sidearm again may be a life-saving move. So I don't want to discount those. And finally, I'll throw one more in. It's just fun. If you're a 3-gun competition shooter or some other kind of sporting event that allows for that, do it. And don't apologize. I'm not looking for that. I'm simply saying that in the tactical world of patrolling operations, change your magazine.